this is some of the bench tools that I have. So on the left hand side there's a bench grinder. This is really handy for just sharpening up drills, chisels and things like that. Not used that often on my hacky builds, but yeah, definitely for sorting out some of those blunt edges and getting them back to sharp. In front of that is a bench vise, and really useful to have a good solid bench vise. This one has seen a lot of use, but yeah, I wouldn't be without it. And then sitting in the middle is the angle grinder, and we'll have a look at that in a bit more detail later on. Standing up on the right hand side is a drill press. This is an upgrade from the previous one I had. Very useful, and sitting on top of it is the bench vise itself. And as we just pan and have a look at that a bit more, you can see the bench vise, there's a drill sitting in it, and below there is the handle. And what the handle really allows you to do is move the workpiece up and down. My previous one, you sort of had to loosen it off, jiggle it up, and then set it. Pretty awkward. This one, it's really handy to be able to do that. You can vary the speed with the belts up at the top, a little bit more fiddly, but at the end of the day, definitely recommend a good solid drill press if you're going to build any of these sort of toys. So sitting here is a small lathe. It's the usual sort of Chinese 7x14 lathe. It's seen a lot of use. I would say if I had my time again, I would not buy one of these. They're very useful to have, but really this is a bottom end lathe. And although I've followed the YouTubes and done the upgraded the gearbox from plastic to steel gears, trying to improve the gibs to give it extra stability on there. At the end of the day, fundamentally at this size, it's really hard to do the work that's necessary for these sort of things. So you can see in there's a small workpiece, that's silver steel. It will struggle to cut that because it's quite a hard material. Softer materials, it's fine. And also, if you're looking to turn down axles, the distance between centres is pretty small. So, although it's very useful, next time round, I would definitely recommend getting a bigger lathe, more solid. I know that doesn't always fit within budgets, but I think it'd be money well spent and ultimately give you more flexibility in the build process. So here we are, one fairly dusty welder. This is an arc welder come TIG. It's from Artec. I did have a fairly cheap, just very transformer based arc welder before. I moved on to this. Definitely recommend Artec as a supplier of welding equipment. I know, especially with the sort of materials that we're building these toys out of, but the metal is generally quite thin. It's usually sort of 2mm if you're lucky. So arc isn't necessarily the most ideal subject for that. TIG would be better. I do mean to get a TIG welder at some point, but being careful with the arc welder, keeping the amps and getting the right rods, keeping the metal very clean. I'm going to be sort of okay. Prefer to MIG it, but save that for another day. Generally use 7018 rods for all my welding. I just find that gives a sort of good balance between weld, the amount of slag, cleanness of weld. I know there's loads of varieties, people write books on this sort of stuff, but for me this does the job. What it's also sitting on as you can see, is a table with lots of holes on. This is a welding table, bought it as a kit, welded it up. It's not necessarily the absolute flattest table, but it's really helpful. It's my welding table come main workbench, so you know it gets a lot of use as well. I also made up some welding clamps. I looked at these, and these just drop in and allow you to then tighten the workpiece up there. I did look at buying these, but these were silly price to buy those sort of clamps, so instead I bought a couple of, well, quite a few of these. They normally had a piece which ran out here, cut that off, welded on, this one pretty badly, but welded on some round stock with a groove cut with the angle grinder, and they just do the job. So yeah, definitely recommend just making up some of those clamps because they proved invaluable. You can put your work around the table, clamp it down, and then get on with the welding of it. Here we have the sort of ubiquitous angle grinder. Everybody needs angle grinder in their life, especially doing these jobs. There's three types of discs in front of it. You've got a flat wheel. Those flat wheels are really good for just cleaning up steel without really taking away metal. Definitely recommended. In the middle is a bit of an old grinding disc. They can be quite harsh, but if you've built up too much weld, then having the grinding disc is very helpful to be able to get that sort of looking a bit more professional. And on the right hand side is a wire brush that fits onto the angle grinder. Those are great things to have. Gets rid of all the slag, gets it back to bright metal so you can see where you are and what you've really been working on. Fitted into the angle grinder at the moment is just a really thin cutting disc. Get through lots of those. You know, the quality seems pretty low on the ones that I buy, so you sneeze and it seems to disintegrate. Another good reason for wearing things like the protection on there. But yeah, I buy them in 10-20 packs and use those to help cut through things as well. Now this is something you don't necessarily have to have, but I've found it really useful. So this is for cutting metal. It'll cut other things of course, but really for cutting metal, and just saves all that work with either grinding disc or hacksaw. Especially because I managed to break my wrist a couple of years ago. This takes the strain out of doing all that work, especially if you've got lots of cuts. Very useful. These give off an immense amount of steel chippings. They're both very noisy, very messy. So well worth having. I think this was around £100. You can use angle grinder. I used angle grinder for many years to do this job, but this just makes it so much easier. And with a good sharp blade, you get a better, cleaner, more accurate cut with one of these than you would, for example, with your sort of standard cutting disc. So one tool I never knew I needed in my life until I had one is an impact driver. You know, I've done lots of woodwork before and switching between drills and screw heads with a sort of battery drill. Always done that. But when you're building these little electric cars, then there's lots of bolts that you end up screwing, unscrewing, and yes, you can use ratchets, and I always use ratchets, but actually it got to a point where it was like, this is a bit boring. So for a present, birthday, Christmas, I had one of these, and oh yes, it's something I should have had much sooner. Not only for these sort of projects, but just general work around the house as well. So yeah, I've still got the battery drill, and that does a great job at supplying holes, but this is really the business when it comes to putting things together quickly, conveniently, with a whole mix of sockets that you generally collect over time. Running across the back of the workshop, you can see I've got various helmets. I've got a couple of welding helmets, really only used for one on the right, but these are self-dimming and make it really easy to set the work up, then go straight into the welding. Because I wear reading glasses, I tend to use the full face mask. So if I'm grinding, cutting, I use the full face mask. That obviously allows me to wear the glasses at the same time. It's also useful. Some of these things give off lots of small bits, flecks of metal, and just that full face mask does protect for that. And on the right hand side, ear defenders. Definitely if you're grinding, then having those is a really valuable thing to have. So here we have really what I'd say is the electronics bench. On the right hand side we've got a solder station, so that's temperature controlled. It's also got a hot air gun, which is great for heat shrink cabling, so when you come to wire them up, you've both got the soldering iron and the heat shrink. So yeah, the two really go well together. Just to the left of it is a larger soldering iron. Some of the wires that you have to do are quite large in terms of cross section, they take a lot of heating up, so that's quite a cheap 100-watt soldering iron. I've been through a few of those, but not necessarily the most temperature controlled soldering irons, but if you just want to put a lot of heat in quickly, then they definitely do the job. We've got here a multimeter, really useful, just checking your connections, checking voltages, checking resistance, stuff like that. And over there we've got some helping hands and a magnifying glass. The magnifying glass is really helpful, you know, just checking things out. Not so much on the wires, but if you're checking one of the speed controllers, then looking at fine tracks, then having that available is very useful. Something I've made myself, it's a bit dusty, but you get the general impression. This is just a small test rig. What it allows me to do is take a couple of batteries, plug them in on the right hand side, and with a volt ammeter see what usage is being drawn from any devices plugged in on the left. So what I've done is I've got a mixture of XT90, XT60 and XT30 connections, so I can plug in, you know, things like speed controllers and other things into it, test them, and then, you know, safely on a bench conveniently. And yeah, well worth the effort just to put a little test rig together. You do have to be disciplined, of course, because you can't then go off and run EC5 connections or something like that, but I've found this really useful, and been able to check quickly, you know, some of the speed controllers and things like that, which would have just been a bit more tricky without that being available.